If Darren Aronofsky's mother and Alex Garland's man had a baby, well, it would be Beau is Afraid, without a doubt.
Whoa! No! No! No!
No! God, please, no! No!
Welcome back to Torn Apart. Today we're talking about two films, Beau is Afraid and Evil Dead Rise. Two of the most awaited films for me of this year, without a doubt. Mostly because I love the Evil Dead franchise and because I love Ari Aster's work. When it comes to Hereditary, it's definitely one of the freshest kind of takes on possession slash haunting horror that we've seen in the last 10 years. And when it comes to Midsommar, it's without a doubt a very interesting horror movie taking place during the day. The real reason why I decided to make this video is because once I watched both films, I realized that they're all about mothers, they're all about motherhood, and I think there are some interesting things we can say about those specific themes and compare and contrasting these two films. So let's start with Beau is Afraid, for example.
You will walk many miles. Dozens will become hundreds. Hundreds will become thousands. Your adventures will continue for years and years.
I just need to get home.
I know.
When I think about Ari Aster, the first thing I think about is incredibly good editing, incredibly good cinematography, and the detailed production design, incredible performances, the perfect package at the end of the day. And when you think about it, everything I just set up here was actually present in Beau is Afraid. It's just that it's so incredibly messy that most of it doesn't really stand out to save the movie. I feel like there are two types of audiences when it comes to Beau is Afraid. Ari Aster fans and people who randomly arrived at the theater being like, oh, this looks nice. And if you are an Ari Aster fan and you're expecting like a horrific movie, then you will definitely be disappointed by Beau is Afraid. If you are a random person who just happened to walk in, you will be so incredibly bored. Like, this is an incredibly slow 3-hour movie, and actually it almost felt like a director's cut, meaning that there were so many incredible shots that could have been cut. And when I say they could have been cut, it just means that the camera kept going and nobody was calling cut. It was literally just 5 seconds longer than it needed to be. Sometimes it was to create a comedic effect, but most of the times it was just too long and boring and unnecessary at the end of the day. I would actually argue that if you took 1 hour away from this movie, this would be a masterpiece without a doubt, because it has all the elements to make an incredible movie. The production design is incredibly cool. The first part of the movie, and I would actually argue the second act as well, work incredibly well. The audience was really reacting as it was supposed to, being horrified when they needed to be horrified, laughing out loud when the movie was being completely ridiculous on purpose, of course. Ari Aster was actually there being like, even if you don't like this movie, I hope at least you have a laugh. So it means that this movie was intentionally trying to make you laugh. It is a weird tragic comedy, and that when all the problems started for me as well, because it is kind of like shifting from one genre to the other, from one tone to the other, addressing so many different themes at the same time, and the result is kind of a mess. But at the same time, I am a art house fan, and this is one of the most expensive art house movies I've ever seen. That's why I talked about Mother. You could even think about Cloud Atlas as well, where you can really see the vision of the director behind the movie, but you can also see where there needed to be someone like pulling him back, being like, Ari Aster, you need to take a chill pill. This movie is going into weird directions just to be weird and not necessarily to enhance any kind of theme. But when I say that this is talking about different themes at the same time, I need to go into details because it's kind of insane. You can literally pick 10 people in the theater and you could have a very different reading from each and every one of them, and probably most of them would be right. This movie is about a mental health crisis, of course. It's about the danger of gentrification and leaving people behind, kind of like the social system not working for the poorest people who are living in the streets, for example. We kind of have some deconstruction of toxic masculinity. Of course, this entire movie is also like an Oedipus complex kind of metaphor.
All men secretly really want to have sex with their mothers. It's the Oedipus complex.
Oedipus, who literally gouged his own eyes out and killed himself when he found out he accidentally had sex with his mother. I'm sorry, it's the what complex?
We are referring to the monstrous mother as well, which is a figure that Ari Aster seems to be incredibly interested in. If you just look at Hereditary and any kind of horror movie where basically femininity, but especially motherhood, are depicted to be something incredibly dangerous that destroys women's bodies and minds. You can even have a reading of this movie about Jewish generational trauma and how basically it is impacting the new but also the old generation of Jews, and how basically people are just living their lives in fear.
Don't want to bring up the Holocaust. I know the Holocaust, but the Holocaust was a really big deal. Remember that we suffered. This DJ is terrific. Remember that we suffered.
My grandma's a survivor.
Remember that she suffered.
There is a moment also in the second act of this movie where it also becomes like a reflection on meta-narratives and the importance of telling each other's stories. There is a lot in this movie, but there's definitely one thing that we can agree on. We can definitely not have a feminist reading of this movie because it will drive you insane. In fact, this is the kind of movie that doesn't really fit within 2023 or even within the Me Too era, because if you start looking close at every single female character within this movie, well, they're all representing the nurturer kind of stereotype where everyone is trying to take care of Beau without any reason whatsoever, and also they tend to be very shallow slash badly written characters at the end of the day. If you just look at, for example, the character of Elaine, who is played by Parker Posey in her adult version, I will have to give you spoilers right now because otherwise you will not be able to understand why this is really bad. She basically arrives late to Beau's mother's funeral and she ends up sleeping with Beau, and after that she dies and she's literally disposed of. Her body is taken off camera and we don't see her again. We don't even talk about her. Beau doesn't even seem to feel any regret about killing her during their sexual intercourse. She comes in just for a sex scene where she gets to show off her tits and then she dies. It's incredibly awkward. But this is the main problem I have with this movie, is that it's kind of like a movie about incels. For me, this reading is kind of impossible to question when you just think about the fact that Beau is afraid of having sex with women because he thinks he might kill him. And if you compare that, for example, with the Me Too movement and men basically complaining about the fact that it's so much harder now to flirt or even harass women just casually because basically they will get hurt, and that basically leads to them being incels, so involuntarily celibate. It kind of represents a masculinity that is being like dampened by society, whether by society overall, so other people who are basically trying to shut him off and prevent him from having a life, or it is also dampened by women, especially the mother character, who is basically trying to remove any kind of emotionality that Beau has going on with his life, to the point that he has no control over anything, whether it is material things or whether it is his own emotional state.
Am I dead?
No, you've been healing so quickly. And no organs were hit, and your bleeding was really mild.
And that is a really bad message to have in 2023. In fact, if we can say something about Joaquin Phoenix's performance of this movie here, it is almost the exact opposite of what he did in The Joker, meaning that this is a man that has a lot of mommy issues, of course, he's incredibly repressed, but there is no snapping moment. He never actually takes control of his life. It is kind of a tragedy where he just keeps getting worse and worse to the point that he just decides to lay down and die. If you go back to looking at the female characters, for example, and look at the character of the mother, she's not really well developed when you think about it. She's kind of mentioning a lot of trauma that she's been through because of her son. We have the feeling that she's also manipulating Beau's reality. Basically, we're not really sure whether she's the villain or whether Beau is the villain of his own story at the end of the day. And that is also where the message of the movie kind of gets completely lost, because you don't really know who to trust and you don't really know what to believe, whether you're supposed to believe the weird dream sequences that Beau is enacting, or whether you're supposed to believe normal people around him who are just trying to help him in whatever way it is possible, or whether just society is fucked up and we all deserve to die. Maybe that's one of the messages of this movie, but at the end of the day, we don't really know. And even by the very final moments of this movie, we're kind of like sitting there judging all of the mistakes that Beau has made across his entire life. We don't really know whether he deserves to be punished or whether anyone deserves to be punished at the end of the day.
I've been a bad boy. Bye!
So what is this movie stance? I don't think it has an actual stance at the end of the day. It leaves everything pretty much open-ended, and at the end of the day I left the theater being like, wow, this was something. And I kind of prefer these kind of movies at the end of the day instead of just not feeling anything. I mean, this is one of the most expensive movies the A24 has ever made. I think the budget is approximately $35 million, and I'd rather that they give money to Ari Aster to make weird films like this than to give that money to make another Transformers prequel or Fast and Furious 26 or another Marvel movie, for example. I would rather just have this discussion with you, for example, and kind of like theorize and speculate and even rant a little bit about it, rather than just sitting there and being like, yeah, I was mad, I will forget about it in the next few days. Because you will definitely not forget about Ari Aster's Beau is Afraid, without a doubt. Having said that, do I actually recommend you see that movie? I feel like I went in with very low expectations because I heard that the critics were really mixed on it and some of them were really hating on it. There is a lot of absurd imagery in the film here, so I'm not sure it is for everyone, but at the same time, if you go in managing your expectations, I'm pretty sure you will have a good time because there is a lot of interesting black humor stuff going on here, and as I said before, just the production design and the performances of everyone involved overall will give you an interesting time. Not necessarily a good time, but an interesting time. But anyways, those are all the things I had to say with Beau is Afraid. Let's jump into Evil Dead Rise, which was good, but could have been better.
Mom?
Mommy's with the maggots now.
What will be, will be.
But also because I have really high expectations when it comes to Evil Dead franchise, and I really loved Fede Alvarez's Evil Dead, even though it was completely different from the original franchise. Let's unpack everything. We'll have to go straight into spoilers when it comes to this movie. I feel like it's been out for quite a while, so we have the time now to actually deconstruct everything and to also be objective about it, because I feel like when you're sitting there, if you have a good audience, it is a really orgasmic kind of situation to be in. When the title sequence came on and Evil Dead Rise literally was rising across the screen, it was just beautiful. I really loved a lot of things about this movie. I love the gore. I love the fact that it's incredibly mean and brutal to children, mostly because they seem to be spared a lot of pain when it comes to horror films, but it doesn't really make realistic sense. And I'm actually impressed that it is legal to have such young children be in this incredible bloodfest from the beginning to end for some of them. I really love the hints to the previous franchise. They didn't really feel like they were forced. For example, when the Deadites started chanting Dead by Dawn, I wanted to jump up and down on my seat, you know?
Dead by dawn!
Dead by dawn!
Dead by dawn! Dead by dawn!
Dead by dawn!
Moments like, for example, biting someone's eye and spitting it into someone else's mouth. That's something also that has happened in other Evil Dead movies or even the TV series. I don't really remember exactly in what scene. And I actually really enjoyed how they kind of like try to rework the Book of the Dead to make it look like what happened in 2013, but also to create a couple of new pages to make it a bit different and to spice things up a little bit, because there is something we can say about Evil Dead Rise. It's kind of like a perfect mix in between Evil Dead 2 when it comes to the humor, when it comes to the tone, and Evil Dead 2013.
Hey, Bessie Boo, it's Ellie. Just calling to say hi. And Beth, you have to help me, Beth. You have to. I'm burning alive.
Lee Cronin is kind of like borrowing a lot of different techniques that Sam Raimi used, but also that Fede Alvarez used, and this is the kind of perfect hybrid. But because of that, it doesn't really have a clear identity. Like, I didn't really see what Lee Cronin brought to the table, for example. There is nothing that felt fresh about it. It was just serviceable at the end of the day. And actually, if you want an example of a violent action stunt that they do, which felt kind of like rethreading things that we've seen in the past, you just have to think about the moment when one of the Deadites is biting and chewing glass. And you can see it going through the throat. It's something that we've seen in the movie Oculus as well, when one of the main characters bites into a light bulb, or even in the incredibly iconic Disaster movie.
Bon appetit! Would you like some?
No.
But when it comes to the big horror industry, when it comes to other movies that I've seen in the last few years, it is without a doubt one of the most satisfying movies of a franchise that started in the 80s. If you look at the Halloween franchise, if you look at the Scream franchise. Having said that, I feel like I have to start ranting a little bit, just a little bit, you know?
What does this button do? Please, please, do not push the button. You have no idea what it...
Runtime. And then I will actually start criticizing some of the screenwriting involved and how we could have made it even better. But basically, when it comes to the gore, why so many CGI effects? Like, honestly, from the very first scene, I was just sitting there being like, this doesn't look good. This doesn't look as good as the 2013 version, and it kind of doesn't make sense. Of course, I'm not trying to hide the fact that there is a lot of blood and gore and guts involved in this movie, but there is also a lot of incredibly cringy CGI where you can see, for example, the curse kind of like manifesting on people's skins, and it just doesn't look up to date, and it doesn't look as scary as well. I know that there are some kills which completely rely on CGI and they would not be possible, and those are the interesting things that you could do with CGI. Watching the first few trailers, I really didn't like the makeup that they used for the main actress. It looked incredibly cartoonish. As I said before, it was kind of a mix in between original Evil Dead 2 and the incredibly gory and realistic Evil Dead from 2013. But the problem is also that if you're trying to do a mix in between the two, you don't really know when you're supposed to take things seriously or when you're supposed to laugh. And if there is one thing that I loved about 2013 Evil Dead, is that it scared the shit out of me, but it was also incredibly fun to watch, even though it was not funny, of course.
Oh.
Stop it. Get some help.
And you don't really get that here. This movie is not scary at all. Even if you are like a fan of gore, I'm pretty sure you will not be surprised by most of the gore in this movie. If you've seen Terrifier 2, if you've seen last year The Sadness, this will be a walk in the park for you, without a doubt. There is not the same amount of incredibly ickiness that you had with the 2013 version. And actually, most of the kills and the household items that they end up using, you've seen them in the trailer. And I watched only one of the trailers because I didn't want to be spoiled, and I still felt like there was a lot of things missing, a lot of things that were left on the table. Let's address a bit the script, because I feel like it's a huge missed opportunity. We have basically 3 films that have taken place in a cabin, which is a very small, limited place with not that much that you can exploit at the end of the day, but they always manage to be creative and be fun about it. And here we are in an apartment building, and it kind of feels like we're still in the cabin, meaning that there are so many things that are teased but not really well developed. For example, why don't we get to see any of the other apartments in the entire like floor? Makes no sense. Why do you keep teasing the emergency ladder and we actually never go there? It makes no sense once again. How is it even possible that, for example, there are other people on other floors who end up surviving the night, for example, but didn't hear anything at all? Because that's what you discover in the 3rd act, where there is another person coming down the stairs as if nothing happened, and then she finds all the blood fest in the garage space, basically. That makes no sense at all for me. And that's why when I came out of the theater, I was like, I actually have a better version of this, and I'm gonna pitch it to you.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Imagine, for example, that everything happens in the way that we see it, especially when it comes to the 1st act. So we've got the mother who actually goes down the elevator, goes to the 1st floor, and that's where she gets possessed. And that's when, for example, the elevator stops working. She actually doesn't go immediately up to their floor and to see the children. She doesn't do that. She's not allowed to do that. The entire movie is her going floor by floor, killing as many people as possible until she finally gets to her victims, her true goals, which are the children and her sister. Doesn't that sound incredibly better? Doesn't that sound like we could exploit so much more the geography of an apartment building? Things that you've seen in other films like The Raid, or another incredibly low budget French movie which came out this year, which is called La Tour, and they really exploited the architecture of an apartment building and the kind of like feeling of unease that you have when you're stuck within it, because even though it feels really big, at the end of the day, it is still a lot of different walls, right? And I don't know, it just felt like a lot of wasted potential. This entire movie felt a lot like wasted potential, and it kind of felt like an extended episode of the TV show Ash vs Evil Dead, and it is maybe why I didn't enjoy it that much. I still gave it a 3-star out of 5 on Letterboxd, but I ended up being disappointed. For example, can you explain to me why most of the other guests living on the floor are killed almost entirely off screen, and they are left there until the very end of the movie, where basically they rise once again conveniently when finally the children and the sister manage to get out of the apartment and they start chanting Dead by Dawn. First of all, it makes no sense that what happens so late in the script, but anyways, let's try to forgive that. Just to say that if you had the opportunity of having disposable characters that can die because we don't care about them, why don't you show it? Why don't you show just creative ways for the mother to actually kill all of the occupants of this floor? I really don't understand that, and once again it felt like wasted potential. I also think that because of its 90 minutes run, you could have pushed it a little bit further. For example, you teased that the beginning of this film is linked to the end of this film, and we need to figure out how that's possible by looking at basically the middle part, right? Wouldn't it have been incredibly interesting and almost revolutionary, I will say, from a screenwriting perspective, where after you finally finish the third act of this movie and you feel like, okay, we're done, we enter a second third act where we actually get to see the possessed deadite at the lake killing off everyone, killing off all of her friends, but in a very quickly way, because of course we don't get the time to actually identify with all of these people here. But still, can you imagine like how powerful it would have been to see like a second, third act and to kind of like see the deadites just destroy everything and win? They had an idea of like a framing window to put here to kind of like hype things up for the audience when they were entering to see the movie, and there are a lot of moments in this film that feel like that. One of the most cringeworthy moments for me was the obligatory chainsaw moment, where actually the sister has to get a chainsaw and chainsaw the main villain, because it happened in the previous movies and because it's kind of been established like the most quintessential Evil Dead weapon, so it has to be there.
Based on this motherfucker!
You disgust me. Go on.
It kind of felt cheap. I didn't really want to see it there, and it felt like one of those nostalgia things that didn't really need to exist at the end of the day. A lot of people, for example, have been congratulating this movie for creating a new dynamic where the deadite have actually like taken possession of a mother character, meaning that it is kind of like psychological emotional torture for us to see a mother who is trying to kill and alienate her own children. And at the end of the day, I think that aspect worked really well. In fact, if I could nominate already the actress who is playing the main mother from this movie at the Oscars, I would do it immediately, because I feel like her performance is without a doubt the only thing that keeps this movie together and that keeps giving it sense at the end of the day, because I felt like as soon as she's locked outside of the apartment, the movie kind of like takes a step back and it kind of tries to like calm the mood down, even though that's not really how the Evil Dead movies work at all. It is kind of like a roller coaster that keeps going high, 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 and then goes down and keeps going high and keeps going down. You know, there is no moment where you actually feel like you're safe when it comes to Evil Dead and when it comes to seeing it as a horror franchise. And especially if you look at the new interpretation that was set up by Fede Alvarez. But I definitely think we can applaud the fact that this is probably the first Evil Dead movie ever that manages to have a coherent storyline that is actually interesting, and it doesn't feel like it's there just to fill up time.
All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up. See this? This is my boomstick!
And if you want to talk about motherhood once again, for example, it's quite interesting to note that the character of Beth is dealing with an unpredicted pregnancy, and that the entire movie is basically about her coming to terms with the life that is growing inside her body. So there is a lot of weird body horror stuff going on with her sister, but also within her as well. But the thing that makes this movie stand out more than Boys Afraid at the end of the day is the fact that we're actually siding with the female characters from the beginning to the very end of this movie. So even though Evil Dead Rise is featuring the character of the monstrous mother, it is allowing us to see her perspective and her point of view on the entire situation instead of just pinning her down as a one-dimensional villain. But that is also the thing that makes it so frustrating. There are so many things that I loved about this film, and I'm pretty sure that when I buy it on Blu-ray and I show it to my friends, I will have a good time. It's just that the expectations were there and they were not perfectly met. And I just feel like there is a better version of this movie somewhere out there, and it just really sucks. Those are basically all the things that I have to say about Evil Dead Rise. I still recommend it because I think these are the kind of movies that cost quite a lot of money and they really need your support to exist, because these kind of gory but also fun movies, it's almost a completely niche market when you think about it. Because we had like a horror splatter period in time where we got all these Saw films, The Final Destination, movies like Hostels or even The Human Centipede, but those were not really fun. So it is really rare to see horror comedies like this, especially when they commit so much to trying to be creative at the end of the day. Anyways, those are all the things that I had to say when it comes to Beau is Afraid and Evil Dead Rise. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of each of these movies, if you were disappointed like me or if you had a good time watching both of them. If you liked this video, you're probably gonna like last week's video where basically I was talking about Scream 7, giving you my predictions, but also a very detailed pitch about the movie itself, the cold opening, who the killers should be, and basically I try to fix the entire franchise. Yeah, I know, my ego is up there with the gods of film criticism. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Every single like that you drop will go to the Deadites from Evil Dead, because they are the most interesting kind of villains that we've seen in a really long time when you think about it. I really like that they give them so much personality at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter who is playing them. You can really feel like the Deadite entity, the Evil Dead entity, just works so well as a villain, and I just really hope that it will inspire even more filmmakers in the future, because at the end of the day, it's cool and it is fun. It is not something you can say about a lot of other horror franchises. Anyways, I'm Patrick and this is Torn Apart.
Back in the 90s, I was in a very famous TV show.
Hi, I'm Sam Raimi, the director of The Evil Dead. I've invited Jonathan Ross to see my new movie, Evil Dead 2.
Oh, I don't believe this.
Say, you think this will scare the audience as much as the first one?
Yeah, that's a safe bet, Sam. It's got a lot more surprises.
Oh yeah, it's got a lot in it to grab the audience.
There's only one movie scarier than The Evil Dead, Evil Dead 2. Kiss your nerves goodbye.
Da 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 da